The lecture hall at the Galactic Medical Academy buzzed with the soft chittering of Zeltharian students, their crystalline exoskeletons catching the artificial light as they settled into their seats. Dr. Vexthul, a towering insectoid with compound eyes that sparkled like black diamonds, adjusted the holographic display floating above the podium. Today's lesson: comparative pain tolerance across sentient species. Lieutenant Sarah Freeman sat in the back row, her olive-green military uniform marking her as one of the few human exchange students in the prestigious institution. Around her, the other species whispered in their native tongues, occasionally glancing her way with what she'd learned to recognize as barely concealed amusement. "Now, class," Dr. Vexthul's voice resonated through the chamber, translated into perfect standard galactic through neural implants. "We must understand that pain tolerance varies dramatically across the known sentient races. The Karathi, for instance, can withstand temperatures that would instantly vaporize most organic matter." The hologram shifted to display a hulking, rock-like being standing calmly in what appeared to be molten lava. A ripple of impressed clicks echoed through the audience. Sarah made notes on her datapad, her stylus moving steadily across the surface. "The ethereal minds of Proxima 7 can simply disconnect their consciousness from physical sensation entirely," the professor continued, showing footage of translucent, jellyfish-like creatures floating serenely while being subjected to what looked like electrical torture. "And our own Zeltharian nervous system processes pain as merely data, allowing us to continue functioning even with severe physical trauma." More approving sounds from the insectoid majority in the class. "But humans," Dr. Vexthul's mandibles clicked in what Sarah had learned was the equivalent of a condescending smile, "represent perhaps the most fascinating case study in pain sensitivity. Their primitive nervous system amplifies every sensation, making even minor injuries feel catastrophic. They possess what we call evolutionary emotional coupling. Their pain response is tied to powerful emotional reactions that can cause complete mental breakdown." Sarah's stylus paused mid-stroke. She felt the familiar heat rising in her cheeks, but kept her expression neutral. Around her, several students turned to look at her directly now, their various forms of eyes glittering with curiosity and pity. A Karathi student, her granite-like face showing the barest hint of concern, raised a massive stone hand. "Professor, are you saying humans are essentially fragile?" "Oh, extremely so," Dr. Vexthul replied, his excitement growing as he warmed to his favorite topic. "Human skin tears from minor abrasions that wouldn't even register to most species. Their bones snap under pressures that we would consider gentle, and most fascinating of all, their pain threshold is so low that they've developed elaborate medical systems just to manage routine procedures that other species handle without assistance." The hologram now showed comparative anatomical charts, human nervous systems highlighted in angry red networks that seemed to pulse with hypersensitivity, contrasted against the simplified, logical neural pathways of other species. "I've read reports," chimed in a Zeltharian student, her voice carrying that peculiar harmonic quality of her people, "that humans actually lose consciousness from pain alone. Is that accurate?" "Indeed. They call it shock, a complete system shutdown when pain levels exceed their pathetically low threshold. It's a survival mechanism, really, because their conscious minds simply cannot process intense physical trauma without permanent psychological damage." Sarah's knuckles went white as she gripped her stylus. She'd seen friends die in combat, had held their hands as medics worked frantically to save them. She'd watched Marines continue fighting with wounds that would have killed weaker beings, had seen ordinary humans perform extraordinary acts of courage despite, or perhaps because of, their capacity to feel every ounce of pain. But she said nothing. Not yet. "In fact," Dr. Vexthul continued, pulling up another chart, "human military doctrine specifically accounts for this weakness. They use extensive pain management protocols, advanced medical support, and even psychological conditioning to help their soldiers function despite their species' inherent limitations. It's quite admirable, really, like watching a flightless bird try to soar. The comparison drew actual laughter from several students. Sarah felt something cold and hard settle in her stomach, but her training kicked in. Observe, learn, adapt, react only when necessary. Now, this brings us to today's practical exercise, the professor announced, his compound eyes scanning the room with obvious pleasure. We'll be examining pain response in real time using our volunteer subjects. Who would like to participate in a comparative demonstration? Several hands shot up immediately, mostly Karathi and Zeltharian students eager to showcase their species' superiority. But Dr. Vexthul's gaze fixed on Sarah with the intensity of a predator selecting prey. "Lieutenant Freeman," he said, his voice carrying across the silent room, "perhaps you'd be willing to help us demonstrate human pain sensitivity? Purely for educational purposes, of course. We have excellent medical facilities standing by." Every eye in the room turned to her. Sarah could feel the weight of their expectations, their assumptions, their barely concealed eagerness to see the fragile human crumble under the slightest pressure. She stood slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled. "What did you have in mind, Professor?" Dr. Vexthul's mandibles clicked with satisfaction. "Oh, nothing too strenuous. Perhaps a simple pressure test. We can gradually increase force on your hand until you reach your pain threshold. The other species typically require industrial-grade equipment to even register discomfort, but for humans, we can use this simple mechanical device." He gestured to what looked like a modified vise on the demonstration table, its metal jaws gleaming under the harsh lights. "We'll start very gently, of course. We wouldn't want to actually injure you." The condescension in his voice was thick enough to cut with a blade. Sarah walked down the steps toward the front of the class, her boots clicking against the polished floor with military precision. Behind her, she could hear whispered conversations in a dozen different languages, all variations on the same theme. How quickly would the human break? Sarah reached the demonstration table and examined the device with the same calm attention she'd given enemy fortifications during her tours of duty. It was indeed a simple pressure mechanism, 2 metal plates connected by a screw mechanism that could be gradually tightened, crude but effective. "Now, Lieutenant," Dr. Vexthul said, positioning himself beside the device like a showman preparing his grand finale, "simply place your hand between the plates. We'll increase pressure slowly until you signal that you've reached your limit. The measurement will be displayed here for the class to observe." Sarah looked up at the eager faces surrounding her. Some showed genuine scientific curiosity, others barely disguised schadenfreude. A few, she was surprised to note, seemed almost concerned for her well-being. "What's the record?" she asked casually, rolling up her sleeve. "Record?" Dr. Vexthul's antennae twitched with amusement. "Oh, my dear student, this isn't a competition. We're simply demonstrating the vast differences in pain tolerance between species. The device can generate up to 50,000 pounds per square inch of pressure, but we've never needed to use more than a fraction of that for humans." "What's the current threshold for human subjects?" The professor consulted his datapad. The previous human volunteer reached approximately 400 PSY before requesting cessation. A Karathi student later that day reached 47,000 PSY and reported it as mildly noticeable. Sarah nodded and slipped her right hand between the metal plates. The cold steel felt familiar against her palm, not unlike the grip of her service weapon or the metal bulkheads of the transport ships that had carried her across 3 different war zones. "Excellent. Now, I'll begin with just a few pounds of pressure." Dr. Vexthul reached for the control mechanism. "Professor," Sarah said quietly, "before we start, I should mention something." "Yes?" "I grew up in the Detroit metropolitan area." She said it like it should mean something. Dr. Vexthul's compound eyes blinked in confusion. I'm afraid I don't understand the relevance of your geographic origin. Detroit, industrial city. My father worked in the old automotive plants before they went fully automated. My mother was a trauma surgeon at Detroit General. Sarah's voice remained conversational, almost casual. They met when he came in after a machine accident, crushed 3 fingers in a hydraulic press. How unfortunate. He finished his shift first, wrapped his hand in electrical tape, and kept working for another 6 hours because the plant couldn't afford downtime. Sarah's eyes found Dr. Vexthuls and held them. Then he walked to the hospital instead of calling an ambulance because he said the injury wasn't bad enough to waste money on. The professor's mandibles clicked uncertainly. I see. Well, human stubbornness is well documented, but that doesn't change the physiological. My mother spent 18 years stitching up factory workers, gang members, and accident victims without full anesthetic because the hospital was underfunded. She learned to work fast because her patients couldn't afford to be unconscious. Sarah flexed her fingers against the metal plates, testing their position. I grew up watching her pull glass shards out of drunk drivers with tweezers while they stayed awake to answer police questions. The lecture hall had gone completely silent. Even the constant ambient chittering of the Zeltharian students had stopped. When I was 12, Sarah continued, I helped my neighbor rebuild his motorcycle engine. 3rd-degree burns on both hands from grabbing a hot exhaust pipe. We were too far from the hospital and too poor for emergency services, so my mother showed me how to treat it with ice water and electrical tape while she held me down and I screamed. Dr. Vexthul's antennae were now completely still, a sign of deep concentration or concern among his species. By 14, I was working construction summers with my uncle. Nail gun accident put a 3-inch spike through my foot. Job site was remote, no medical facilities for 50 miles. Uncle Mike pulled it out with pliers, poured hydrogen peroxide in the hole, and I finished the day because we needed the money. A Karathi student leaned forward, her stoned features showing the first signs of genuine interest rather than amusement. Military training started when I was 18. Hand-to-hand combat, survival scenarios, resistance training. Do you know what SEER school is, Professor? No. Survival, evasion, resistance, escape. They teach you to function when everything hurts, when you're broken and bleeding and exhausted and they're still coming for you. They teach you that pain is just information and you can choose what to do with that information. Sarah's voice never changed inflection, never rose above that same conversational tone. But something in the room had shifted. The eager anticipation had been replaced by a growing sense of unease. My first combat deployment, I was shot through the shoulder by a sniper. Kevlar stopped most of it, but a fragment made it through. I dug it out with my knife blade while still returning fire because my squad was pinned down and I was the only one with a clear shot at the enemy position. She paused, looking around the room at faces that were no longer showing amusement. Second deployment, IED blast threw me 30 feet into a concrete wall, broke 4 ribs, dislocated my shoulder, and gave me a concussion that made me vomit blood for 3 days. I carried 2 wounded Marines to safety before I let the medics look at me, because that's what humans do. We endure. Dr. Vexthul's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. Lieutenant, perhaps we should postpone this demonstration. Third deployment, Sarah continued, as if he hadn't spoken. Chemical weapons attack. Nerve agent. Do you know what it feels like when your nervous system starts shutting down while you're still conscious? Every muscle fiber feels like it's tearing apart from the inside. Your skin feels like it's on fire while simultaneously going numb. Your lungs forget how to work properly, so every breath is like drowning in razor blades. The silence in the room was now complete and absolute. I stayed conscious for 4 hours while the antidotes worked their way through my system, coordinating evacuation for my squad, because someone had to keep them alive, and I was the ranking officer. Pain is just pain, Professor. It's what you choose to do while experiencing it that matters. She looked down at her hand between the metal plates, then back up at Dr. Vexthul. "Now, shall we begin your little experiment?" Dr. Vexthul's compound eyes reflected the overhead lights like fractured mirrors as he stared at the human before him. Around the lecture hall, students who had been eagerly anticipating an easy demonstration of human weakness now sat in uncomfortable silence. The atmosphere had shifted dramatically, and the professor found himself questioning the wisdom of his pedagogical approach. Yes, of course," he managed, his usually confident voice carrying an uncertain tremor. "We'll begin with minimal pressure, as planned." His manipulator appendage hesitated over the control mechanism. What had seemed like a straightforward educational exercise now felt somehow predatory, as if he were about to torture someone who had already endured more than most beings could imagine. "Professor," Sarah said quietly, "the pressure." Yes, of course." He engaged the mechanism, and the digital display flickered to life. 10 psi, 20, 50, 100. Sarah's expression didn't change. She might have been standing in a garden watching flowers bloom for all the reaction she showed. The pressure climbed. 200, 300, 400. "This is where the previous human subject stopped," Dr. Vexthul announced to the class, though his voice lacked its earlier enthusiasm. "Interesting," Sarah replied. The pressure reading continued climbing. 500, 600, 750. Murmurs began rippling through the audience. Several students leaned forward in their seats, their various sensory organs focused intently on the human who was now far exceeding their expectations. 1000 psi. Dr. Vexthul's antennae twitched nervously. "Lieutenant, are you experiencing any discomfort?" "Define discomfort," Sarah replied, her voice still conversational. "I can feel the pressure, if that's what you're asking. It's not pleasant, but I've had dental work that was worse." 1250 psi. A Zeltharian student in the front row made a high-pitched sound of distress. Apparently, that was approaching the threshold where her species would begin to feel actual pain. "Perhaps we should," Dr. Vexthul began. "Continue," Sarah said firmly. "This is educational, remember? We're gathering data on comparative pain tolerance." 1500 psi. Sarah's hand was now under pressure that would crush the delicate manipulator appendages of most species in the room. She stood motionless, her breathing steady, her pulse visible in her neck, maintaining its regular rhythm. "This is impossible," whispered a Karathi student. "Humans aren't supposed to be able to." 2000 psi, Dr. Vexthul announced, his voice tight with disbelief. For the first time, Sarah showed a reaction. Her jaw muscles tensed slightly, and she shifted her weight almost imperceptibly. But when she spoke, her voice remained steady. "You know what I'm thinking about right now, Professor?" What?" "My grandmother. She lived through the Second Resource War, back when Earth was still dealing with the climate crisis. Detroit was one of the contested zones. Not enough clean water, too many people, corporations fighting over what was left. 2500 psi. The pressure was now well beyond what most species could survive, let alone tolerate consciously. She was trapped in a collapsed building for 3 days during the siege. Concrete beam across her legs, pinning her down. She had a Swiss Army knife and a bottle of water. Do you know what she did? The question hung in the air. Dr. Vexthul found himself genuinely curious, despite the growing horror of the situation. She amputated her own leg, tied off the bleeding with her shoelaces, carved through bone and muscle with a knife blade, and crawled a quarter-mile to reach the evacuation zone. 3000 psi. Sarah's hand was now under pressure that would pulverize the appendages of any other species present, yet she continued to stand calmly, telling her story as if they were having coffee. She lived another 40 years after that, raised 6 children, including my father, never complained about the pain, never took disability payments, never considered herself a victim. She used to say that pain was just the price of staying alive, and life was too precious to waste worrying about the cost. Several students were now showing visible signs of distress, not from their own discomfort, but from watching what they were beginning to recognize as something extraordinary. 3,500 psi. Dr. Vexthul's manipulator trembled as he maintained pressure on the control mechanism. "Lieutenant, this is far beyond what you expected from a human?" Sarah's eyes met his, and he saw something there that made his exoskeleton shiver. Not pain, not fear, but a kind of quiet, implacable strength that he'd never encountered before. "Maybe your data was incomplete. 4,000 psi. The display numbers glowed red now, indicating pressure levels that the device's designers had never intended for biological testing. "I'm curious about something, Professor," Sarah continued. "You mentioned that pain tolerance varies across species. But did you consider that maybe what you're measuring isn't pain tolerance at all?" "I don't understand." "Maybe you're measuring something else entirely. Maybe you're measuring how different species define strength. 4,500 psi. Sarah's hand was now under pressure that would flatten most metals. Her breathing had quickened slightly, and a thin sheen of perspiration appeared on her forehead, but she remained upright and alert. "Some species," she continued, "define strength as the absence of pain, the ability to shut it off, disconnect from it, pretend it doesn't exist. But humans, we define strength differently. 5,000 psi. The pressure reading was now approaching levels that the safety protocols should have automatically prevented. Dr. Vexthul realized that he should stop the demonstration, but found himself paralyzed by the implications of what he was witnessing. "We define strength as the ability to feel everything, every ounce of pain, every fragment of trauma, every sharp edge of reality, and still choose to keep going, not because we can't feel it, but because we can feel it, and we refuse to let it stop us." The lecture hall was so quiet that the soft hum of the environmental systems seemed loud. Every student was focused on the small human woman who was systematically destroying everything they thought they knew about her species. "That's what you missed in your research, Professor. You looked at our medical systems and saw weakness, but maybe you should have asked why we developed those systems in the first place. Maybe you should have asked what kind of species looks directly at pain and says, 'We're going to find a way to help each other through this.' 5,500 psi. Sarah's voice was tighter now, controlled but carrying an edge that suggested she was approaching some kind of limit. But still, she stood. Still she spoke. Still she maintained that unnerving, direct eye contact. "Maybe you should have asked what kind of species sends soldiers into combat, knowing they'll feel every bullet, every explosion, every moment of terror, and they go anyway because someone has to protect the people they love." The numbers on the display continued climbing, and Dr. Vexthul realized that he was no longer conducting a scientific demonstration. He was witnessing something that would fundamentally change how the galactic community understood humanity. The pressure gauge read 6,000 psi when the first hairline crack appeared in the metal plate above Sarah's hand. The sound was barely audible, a soft ping that seemed to echo through the silent lecture hall like a gunshot. Dr. Vexthul's compound eyes widened as he stared at the display, his mandibles clicking in a rapid pattern that indicated extreme distress. The equipment," he stammered. "It's not designed for these levels." Sarah's voice came out steady, despite the obvious strain she was now under. Small beads of sweat had formed on her forehead, and her breathing was more controlled, deliberate. "Then perhaps we should discuss the real lesson here. 6,500 psi. More stress fractures appeared in the metal, spreading like spider webs across the surface of the pressure plates. Several students in the front row instinctively moved back in their seats. "You see," Sarah continued, her words measured but unwavering, "there's something your research missed about human physiology. We don't just experience pain, we learn from it. Every injury, every trauma, every moment of agony teaches us something about survival. A Karathi student, her granite features showing unprecedented concern, spoke up. But Lieutenant, the cellular damage at these pressure levels will heal, Sarah finished. That's another thing about humans. We're not just tough, we're adaptive. Bones that break grow back stronger, muscles that tear rebuild with more fibers, skin that's damaged develops thicker calluses. 7,000 psi. The cracks in the metal were now clearly visible, and Dr. Vexthul was beginning to panic. Lieutenant, I must insist we stop. The liability... Liability? Sarah's voice carried a hint of dark humor. Professor, I've been shot, blown up, poisoned, and set on fire in service to the Galactic Defense Alliance. I think I can handle a squeaky piece of classroom equipment. 7,500 psi. The pressure reading was now so far beyond normal parameters that several students were pulling out their personal recording devices, recognizing they were witnessing something that would be discussed in academic circles for years to come. You want to know the real difference between humans and other species? Sarah asked, her voice now carrying a slight rasp from the strain. It's not that we feel more pain or less pain. It's that we've learned to use pain as fuel. 8,000 psi. The metal plate gave another ominous crack, and Dr. Vexthul's manipulator hovered over the emergency stop control. Every human child learns this lesson eventually, Sarah continued. Sometimes life hurts. Sometimes it hurts so much you think you can't take another second, but you discover that you can, and then you discover that you can again, and again, and eventually you realize that your capacity for endurance is limited only by what you're willing to endure it for. A Zeltharian student in the middle section made the harmonic sound her species used to express profound realization. You're not just tolerating the pain, you're choosing it. Exactly. Sarah's eyes found the student and held her gaze. Choice is the key. Pain happens to us, but suffering is a choice. Giving up is a choice. Letting the pain define us is a choice. 8,500 psi. The sound of metal under stress was now constant, a low groaning that seemed to vibrate through the floor of the lecture hall. I had a squad mate once, Sarah said, her voice taking on the tone of someone sharing a sacred memory. Private Martinez, smallest guy in our unit, maybe 130 pounds soaking wet. IED blast took his left leg off at the knee. The pressure climbed to 9,000 psi. Sarah's hand was now under pressure that would compress diamond, yet she stood talking as if she were describing a routine training exercise. Martinez woke up in the field hospital 3 days later. First thing he said wasn't, "Where's my leg?" or "How bad is it?" or "Will I walk again?" First thing he said was, "Did everyone else make it out?" Dr. Vexthul's antennae were completely flat against his head now, a posture his species adopted in the presence of something beyond their understanding. When they told him about his leg, you know what he said? "Good thing I've got another one. When can I get back to my squad?" Sarah's voice carried a mixture of pride and sadness. They tried to discharge him, told him his fighting days were over. He spent 2 years learning to use a prosthetic, then volunteered for the most dangerous assignment available, bomb disposal. 9,500 psi. The cracks in the metal had spread so extensively that the entire upper plate looked like a broken window held together by surface tension. Martinez defused over 300 explosive devices after losing his leg, saved thousands of lives. When reporters asked him how he could do such dangerous work with a disability, he said, "I'm not disabled. I'm specialized. I know exactly how much damage the human body can take and still keep functioning." 10,000 psi. The display flashed red warnings, and emergency protocols began attempting to engage, but Dr. Vexthul had overridden them in his fascination with what he was witnessing. That's what you missed in your research, Professor. You looked at human medical data and saw weakness. You should have looked at our military records and seen what we accomplish despite being fragile. A student in the back row, one of the rare ethereal minds attending physical classes instead of participating virtually, spoke in the whisper-soft mental voice of his species. Your tolerance is not just physical, it's spiritual. Maybe, Sarah agreed, or maybe it's just practical. When you know that pain is temporary, but the things you protect aren't, the math becomes simple. 10,500 psi. The metal plate above Sarah's hand was now more crack than solid material. Dr. Vexthul's academic curiosity warred with his growing terror at what might happen if the equipment failed catastrophically. "Lieutenant," he said urgently, "I believe we've gathered sufficient data." "Have we?" Sarah's eyes swept the room, taking in the faces of students who had entered the class expecting to see a demonstration of human weakness, and instead found themselves confronting the possibility that everything they'd been taught about pain, strength, and endurance might be fundamentally wrong. "Because I don't think the lesson is complete yet." 11,000 psi. The pressure reading was now in ranges that materials science textbooks listed as destructive to most known substances. Yet Sarah remained standing, her hand trapped between metal plates that should have crushed it to paste, speaking with the calm authority of someone who had looked into the abyss and decided it wasn't particularly impressive. "You want to see the real difference between humans and other species?" she asked. "It's not in how we handle pain. It's in what we're willing to pay in pain to achieve something meaningful." The metal plate gave a final, decisive crack, and the sound of its impending failure filled the room like thunder. The moment the metal plate finally shattered, the lecture hall erupted into chaos. Fragments of steel scattered across the demonstration table with sharp, ringing sounds, while safety alarms began blaring throughout the academy. Dr. Vexthul's compound eyes tracked the flying debris in horror, his manipulator appendages frozen over the now useless controls. But Sarah Freeman stood motionless in the center of the mayhem, her hands still positioned where the pressure plates had been, blood running in thin rivulets down her fingers to drip onto the polished floor. Her expression remained calm, almost contemplative, as if she were observing someone else's injury rather than her own. "Medical emergency," Dr. Vexthul shrieked, his voice carrying the harmonic distress patterns of his species. "Emergency medical to Lecture Hall 7. Immediate intervention required." Students were pushing back from the demonstration area, some making sounds of distress in their native languages, others simply staring in stunned fascination at the human who had just crushed a piece of industrial equipment with her bare hand, or rather, had allowed it to crush itself against her endurance. Sarah lifted her hand and examined it with clinical detachment. The skin was deeply bruised, already swelling, and several small lacerations from metal fragments wept blood. But the bones were intact, the fingers moved normally, and she maintained full sensation and motor control. "Fascinating," she murmured, flexing her fingers experimentally. The human hand contains 27 bones, 34 muscles, and over 3,000 nerve endings. Under 11,000 pounds per square inch of pressure, the nerve endings are certainly reporting damage, but the structural integrity remains essentially sound. "Lieutenant," Dr. Vexthul was beside himself with panic, "you need immediate medical attention. The tissue damage, the potential for infection, the liability implications." "Professor," Sarah interrupted gently, "I appreciate your concern, but this isn't actually that serious." She walked to the emergency medical kit mounted on the wall, her movements steady and purposeful. "Though I admit, it's going to make typing reports annoying for a few days." The medical bay doors burst open, and a team of Galactic Medical Corps personnel rushed in, their scanners already active and treatment protocols engaged. The lead medic, a tall, blue-skinned Arcturian with 4 arms, took one look at Sarah's injured hand and began barking orders in 3 different languages. "Patient shows signs of severe crush trauma, possible fractures, definite soft tissue damage. prepare emergency surgery protocols, and contact xenobiology for human-specific treatment parameters. That won't be necessary, Sarah said calmly, sitting down on the examination chair they'd wheeled in. I need some antiseptic, bandages, and maybe something for the swelling. This is essentially equivalent to what humans call a minor workplace injury. The Arcturian medic's 4 eyes blinked in sequence, a sign of extreme confusion. Minor? Lieutenant, our scanners indicate you've sustained damage that would incapacitate most species for weeks. Most species aren't human. Sarah accepted the antiseptic wipe the medic offered and began cleaning the wounds herself, her movements efficient and practiced. We have extensive experience with this type of injury. I've had worse accidents while cooking dinner. Dr. Vexthul, who had been hovering anxiously nearby, stepped forward. But the pain levels, the neural feedback alone should have caused shock, unconsciousness, possibly permanent psychological trauma. Should have, according to your models, Sarah agreed, wrapping a medical bandage around her knuckles with one-handed expertise that suggested she'd done this many times before. But your models are based on laboratory conditions and theoretical frameworks. They don't account for context, motivation, or training. A Zeltharian student who had been recording the entire incident spoke up hesitantly. Lieutenant, could you explain what you mean by context? Sarah looked up from her bandaging, considering the question. Around the room, the other students leaned forward, their initial shock giving way to genuine curiosity about what they'd witnessed. Context is everything, she said finally. The same stimulus can cause completely different responses depending on circumstances. For example, the pressure I just experienced would be devastating if it were unexpected, uncontrolled, and inflicted by an enemy. But when it's voluntary, measured, and in service of a larger purpose, education, in this case, the experience becomes manageable. She finished securing the bandage and flexed her fingers again, wincing slightly, but maintaining full range of motion. Pain is information. The information I received from this experiment was, tissue damage is occurring, structural integrity is being tested, systems are operating near maximum capacity, but within acceptable parameters. That's useful data. The Arcturian medic was scanning her hand with increasingly sophisticated instruments, his expression growing more bewildered with each reading. Your neural activity patterns, they're completely anomalous. The pain signals are reaching your brain correctly, but your response centers are processing them as routine. Not routine, Sarah corrected. Familiar. There's a difference. I don't understand. Sarah stood up from the examination chair and walked back toward the demonstration table, where fragments of the destroyed pressure plates still glittered under the lights. The students watched her movements carefully, noting that despite the obvious injury, she showed no signs of favoring her damaged hand or limiting its use. Every human child learns to categorize pain, she explained. There's good pain and bad pain. Good pain is the burn in your muscles during exercise, the ache in your hands after productive work, the stiffness that comes from sleeping on the ground under the stars. It's pain that signals accomplishment, growth, meaningful experience. She picked up one of the larger metal fragments, examining its fractured edge. Bad pain is different. It's the pain of injury without purpose, trauma without meaning, suffering that serves no constructive end. We learn very early to distinguish between them. A Karathi student, her granite features thoughtful, asked, and this demonstration was good pain. This demonstration was purposeful pain, Sarah replied. It served a function. It challenged assumptions, generated new data, and hopefully taught everyone in this room something valuable about the nature of strength and endurance. Dr. Vexthul's mandibles were clicking rapidly, a sign of deep cognitive processing. But the physical damage is identical regardless of your psychological categorization. Is it? Sarah set down the metal fragment and looked directly at him. I'm curious, Professor. How long do your medical textbooks say this type of injury should take to heal in a human? The Arcturian medic consulted his scanner readings. Based on the tissue damage patterns, 6 to 8 weeks for full recovery, assuming no complications. Would you be willing to make a small wager on that timeline? The medic's 4 eyes blinked again. What do you mean? I mean, Sarah said, beginning to unwrap the bandage she'd just applied, that human healing rates are also subject to context and motivation. Injuries sustained in meaningful circumstances, accepted voluntarily, and processed constructively, tend to resolve much faster than trauma inflicted without purpose. She pulled away the last of the bandaging, revealing her hand to the room. The students gasped in their various languages. The swelling had already begun to recede. The deeper lacerations had stopped bleeding entirely and were showing the early signs of cellular regeneration. The bruising, while still visible, had faded from the deep purple-black of severe trauma to the lighter colors that typically appeared days into the healing process. "This is impossible," the medic whispered. "No," Sarah said quietly. "This is human." The silence that followed Sarah's revelation stretched across the lecture hall like a held breath. Students who had entered the room with confident assumptions about human fragility now found themselves staring at evidence that fundamentally challenged everything they thought they knew about biology, psychology, and the nature of resilience itself. Dr. Vexthul approached slowly, his compound eyes fixed on Sarah's rapidly healing hand with the intensity of a scientist confronting a phenomenon that shouldn't exist according to established theory. "Lieutenant," he said carefully, "what you're showing us contradicts several fundamental principles of xenobiology." "Does it?" Sarah asked, examining her own hand with the same clinical detachment she'd shown throughout the demonstration. "Or does it suggest that your xenobiology textbooks might be missing some important variables?" The Arcturian medic was frantically recalibrating his scanners, convinced that his equipment must be malfunctioning. "The cellular regeneration rates I'm detecting they're beyond anything we've documented for human physiology. This level of accelerated healing should only be possible with advanced medical intervention or genetic enhancement." "I haven't been genetically enhanced," Sarah said matter-of-factly, "and I haven't received any medical treatment beyond basic antiseptic and bandaging. What you're seeing is baseline human biology operating under optimal conditions." A Zeltharian student raised one of her crystalline appendages hesitantly. "What do you mean by optimal conditions?" Sarah walked to the front of the lecture hall, where the remains of the demonstration equipment still scattered the floor like the aftermath of a small explosion. She moved with easy confidence, showing no signs of protecting her injured hand or limiting its range of motion. "Humans evolved under what galactic standards would consider extraordinarily harsh conditions," she began, her voice taking on the measured cadence of someone sharing hard-won wisdom. "High gravity, extreme weather variations, predators, resource scarcity, and constant environmental challenges. Our bodies didn't just adapt to survive these conditions, they learned to thrive under stress." She picked up one of the larger metal fragments again, this time gripping it firmly enough to demonstrate that her hand strength was unimpaired. "But here's the key factor that most xenobiological studies miss: human healing and recovery rates are directly linked to psychological state, social context, and sense of purpose." Dr. Vexthul's antennae twitched with fascination despite his obvious discomfort with having his academic specialty called into question. "You're suggesting that mental state can influence physical healing rates?" "I'm not suggesting it. I'm stating it as established fact. Every human knows this instinctively, even if they don't understand the mechanism." Sarah set down the metal fragment and turned to address the entire class. "Injuries sustained in combat, in service to others, or in pursuit of meaningful goals heal faster than identical injuries from accidents, attacks, or random misfortune." She paused, letting this concept settle in the minds of beings whose species had largely divorced physical experience from emotional context. There are documented cases of human soldiers continuing to fight effectively with wounds that should have incapacitated them, athletes competing at peak performance levels despite injuries that should have ended their careers, and ordinary people performing extraordinary physical feats during emergencies. The medical community calls it hysterical strength or stress-induced analgesia, but those terms miss the point. A Karathi student spoke up, her voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than the earlier skepticism. What is the point? The point is that humans don't just endure pain, we transform it. Physical trauma becomes emotional resilience, injury becomes experience, suffering becomes strength, but only when it's chosen, accepted, and integrated into a larger sense of purpose. Sarah walked back to where the pressure testing device had been, looking down at the space where she'd stood while metal plates crushed her hand. That's why the healing process you're witnessing isn't actually anomalous. It's what happens when a human sustains injury in a context where that injury serves a greater good. The Arcturian medic looked up from his scanners, his 4 eyes wide with scientific excitement. The cellular activity patterns are unlike anything in our databases. The production of growth factors, the speed of inflammation resolution, the efficiency of tissue repair, it's as if your body is prioritizing recovery in ways that shouldn't be possible without conscious control of autonomous systems. Maybe it is conscious control, Sarah suggested. Maybe humans have more influence over their biological processes than your medical models account for. Maybe the mind-body connection in humans is more integrated than other species experience. Dr. Vexthul was now pacing back and forth, his academic worldview reshaping itself in real time. If what you're suggesting is true, then our entire approach to human medicine, human psychology, human capability assessment, all of it would need to be reconsidered. Would that be so terrible? Sarah asked gently. To discover that a species you'd categorized as fragile might actually be more resilient than you imagined? She moved toward the lecture hall windows, which looked out over the sprawling campus of the Galactic Medical Academy. In the distance, ships from dozens of different species came and went, carrying students and faculty from across the known galaxy to study at one of the most prestigious institutions in civilized space. "You know what I find most interesting about this academy?" she said, her back still turned to the class. "Every species here has sent their best and brightest to learn about medicine, biology, and the nature of life itself, but somehow, in all that learning, you've developed blind spots about what different forms of life might be capable of." She turned back to face the room, and the students could see that her expression had shifted. The earlier calm had been replaced by something more intense, not anger, but a kind of passionate conviction. "You study Karathi thermal resistance and call it miraculous. You analyze Zeltharian neural processing and call it elegant. You examine ethereal mental projection and call it transcendent. But when you encounter human endurance, human adaptability, human refusal to surrender in the face of impossible odds, you call it primitive stubbornness." Several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, recognizing the accuracy of her assessment. "Maybe the real lesson here isn't about pain tolerance at all," Sarah continued. "Maybe it's about the danger of assuming that different means inferior, that unfamiliar means limited, that evolutionary paths different from your own must somehow be less effective." She walked back toward the center of the room, her presence somehow filling the space despite her relatively small stature compared to most of the other species present. Every human child learns a fundamental truth that apparently isn't universal, that strength isn't measured by the absence of vulnerability, but by what you accomplish despite being vulnerable. That courage isn't the absence of fear, but action in the presence of fear. That resilience isn't avoiding damage, but healing from damage and becoming stronger. The Arcturian medic spoke up quietly. "Your hand, the healing rate is actually accelerating. At this pace, you'll have full recovery within hours rather than weeks." Sarah glanced down at her hand, flexing her fingers with growing ease. Of course, the injury served its purpose. My body has no reason to maintain damage that's no longer functionally necessary. Dr. Vexthol's mandibles clicked in what might have been admiration or might have been fear. Lieutenant, what you're demonstrating challenges fundamental assumptions about biological limitations, psychological resilience, and the relationship between physical and mental states. Good, Sarah said simply. Assumptions should be challenged. That's how knowledge advances. She looked around the room one more time, meeting the eyes of students who had come seeking to confirm their existing beliefs and instead found themselves confronting possibilities they'd never considered. I have one more question for all of you, she said. After witnessing what happened here today, are you going to update your understanding of human capabilities, or are you going to dismiss it as an anomaly and go back to your comfortable assumptions? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and the room fell silent as each being present contemplated the implications of what they'd witnessed and what it might mean for everything they thought they knew about the species sharing their galaxy. 3 months later, Dr. Vexthol stood at the podium of the same lecture hall, but the atmosphere was completely different. The room was packed beyond capacity, with students from 17 different species crowding into every available space. Representatives from the Galactic Medical Council occupied the front row, their various sensory organs focused intently on the holographic display floating above the demonstration table. The display showed comparative healing rates across multiple species, but the data that drew gasps of amazement from the crowd was the human curve, a line that defied every established model of biological recovery. Ladies, gentlemen, and esteemed colleagues, Dr. Vexthol began, his voice carrying none of its former condescension. 3 months ago, this room witnessed an event that has fundamentally altered our understanding of human physiology, psychology, and the intersection between mental state and physical capability. The hologram shifted to show cellular analysis from Sarah's injury, time-lapse footage that compressed hours of healing into minutes of visual data. The audience watched in fascination as tissue that should have taken weeks to repair knitted itself back together with unprecedented efficiency. Lieutenant Sarah Freeman's demonstration initially appeared to be a simple pain tolerance test. What we discovered instead was evidence of a biological-psychological integration system that our medical science had completely failed to recognize or understand. In the back of the room, Sarah herself sat quietly, her uniform bearing new insignia that reflected her recent promotion to the Academy's newly created Department of Comparative Resilience Studies. Her hand, which had been crushed between metal plates in this very room, showed no signs of ever having been injured. A Karathi researcher in the front row raised her massive stone hand. Dr. Vexthol, have subsequent tests confirmed these accelerated healing rates in other human subjects? Indeed they have, the professor replied, his compound eyes gleaming with scientific excitement. We've now documented similar phenomena in over 200 human volunteers. The key variables appear to be psychological acceptance of the injury, clear understanding of its purpose, and integration of the experience into a larger framework of meaning. The hologram displayed case studies, human construction workers healing from industrial accidents at rates that defied medical explanation, soldiers recovering from combat injuries with unprecedented speed, even civilian volunteers healing faster from controlled laboratory injuries when they understood those injuries were contributing to medical advancement. But perhaps more importantly, Dr. Vexthol continued, we've discovered that this accelerated healing is just one aspect of a much larger phenomenon. Humans consistently demonstrate enhanced performance across multiple parameters when operating within what they term meaningful contexts. An ethereal mind projected a whisper-soft mental question. Are you suggesting that humans can consciously influence their biological functions? Not consciously in the way your species experiences consciousness, Dr. Vexthol replied. Rather, they seem to possess an unconscious integration system that optimizes physical performance based on psychological and social factors. Purpose, meaning, and context literally change their biology at the cellular level. Sarah stood up from her seat in the back, and the room immediately fell silent. Over the past 3 months, her reputation had spread throughout the academy and beyond. She was no longer just a human exchange student. She had become a subject of intense scientific study and, for many, a representative of capabilities they were only beginning to understand. "Professor, if I may," she said, walking toward the front of the room with that same calm confidence she'd shown during the original demonstration. "Of course, Lieutenant." Sarah moved to stand beside the holographic display, her presence somehow commanding attention despite being physically smaller than most beings in the room. "I've been listening to the discussions about human anomalous capabilities for 3 months now, and I think there's still a fundamental misunderstanding about what you've observed." She gestured to the data floating in the air around her. "You're analyzing our healing rates, our pain tolerance, our stress responses, and you're finding results that don't match your existing models. But you're still approaching this as if humans are somehow uniquely extraordinary." Murmurs of confusion rippled through the audience. "We're not extraordinary," Sarah continued. "We're exactly what any species becomes when it evolves under conditions that require constant adaptation, cooperation, and resilience. The traits you're documenting aren't human anomalies. They're survival characteristics that develop in any species facing sufficient environmental pressure over sufficient time." Dr. Vexthul's antennae perked forward with interest. "You're suggesting that other species could develop similar capabilities?" "I'm suggesting that other species might already have similar capabilities, but in different forms adapted to their specific evolutionary pressures." Sarah walked to the holographic controls and began manipulating the display. "Consider this. Karathi thermal resistance isn't just physical, it's also psychological. Your species doesn't just tolerate extreme temperatures. You remain cognitively functional under thermal stress that would incapacitate most beings." The display shifted to show Karathi neural activity under extreme heat conditions, revealing patterns of maintained cognitive performance that were indeed remarkable. Zeltharian distributed processing isn't just about spreading computational load across your crystalline matrix, Sarah continued, adjusting the hologram again. It's about maintaining individual identity while simultaneously participating in collective consciousness. That requires a form of psychological resilience that's arguably more sophisticated than anything humans have achieved. The Zeltharian students in the audience began chittering among themselves, their harmonic voices creating complex patterns of communication. "And ethereal mental projection," Sarah said, turning toward the whisper-soft presence of the ethereal mind in the room, "requires not just psychic ability, but the courage to maintain individual consciousness while experiencing reality from multiple perspectives simultaneously. That's a form of mental resilience that humans can barely comprehend." The room was now buzzing with excitement as beings began to recognize their own species' capabilities through this new framework of understanding. "So what happened 3 months ago wasn't a demonstration of human superiority," Sarah concluded. "It was a demonstration of how different forms of resilience can appear when viewed through the lens of another species' evolutionary context." She paused, looking around the room at faces that reflected a growing understanding. "But here's what I think is the real lesson. Every species in this room has developed remarkable capabilities for survival, adaptation, and resilience. The problem isn't that we're so different from each other. It's that we've been so focused on our differences that we've missed the opportunities to learn from each other's strengths." Dr. Vexthul stepped forward, his voice carrying a note of wonder. "Lieutenant, are you proposing some form of cross-species capability enhancement?" "I'm proposing that we stop seeing species differences as limitations and start seeing them as resources," Sarah replied. "What could Karathi thermal resilience teach us about human pain management? What could human adaptive healing teach Karathi medicine? What could Zeltharian collective processing teach both our species about collaborative problem-solving? The Galactic Medical Council representatives were now actively recording everything, recognizing that they were witnessing the birth of an entirely new field of study. What could ethereal consciousness projection teach all of us about expanding our understanding of identity, resilience, and the relationship between mind and body? Sarah continued, her voice rising with passionate conviction. She moved back toward the center of the room, addressing the entire assembly. 3 months ago, you thought you were going to watch a human break under pressure. Instead, you discovered that your understanding of what pressure means was limited by your own evolutionary experience. The silence in the room was now electric with possibility rather than uncomfortable with uncertainty. "So here's my challenge to everyone in this room," Sarah said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had proven her points with her own blood and bones. Stop studying each other as curiosities. Start learning from each other as teachers. Stop seeing differences as deficits. Start seeing them as opportunities. She looked directly at Dr. Vexthal, her expression serious, but not unkind. And maybe, just maybe, we'll discover that the galaxy is full of extraordinary beings who've been underestimating each other for far too long. The professor's mandibles clicked in what was unmistakably a gesture of deep respect. "Lieutenant Freeman," he said formally, "would you be willing to lead a new interdisciplinary program in comparative resilience studies? I believe the Academy and the galaxy has much to learn from your perspective." Sarah smiled, the first truly warm expression she'd shown since entering the lecture hall 3 months earlier. "Professor, I thought you'd never ask." As applause began to ripple through the room in the various ways different species expressed approval, Sarah Freeman looked out at an audience that had gathered to witness human limitations and instead discovered the unlimited potential of understanding across the vast diversity of galactic life. The girl who had removed shrapnel with her teeth on a battlefield far from home had become something more than a soldier, more than a student, more than a representative of her species. She had become a bridge between worlds, built from the unshakable foundation of human endurance and the recognition that strength comes not from being unbreakable, but from choosing what to do when breaking becomes inevitable. In the end, the lesson wasn't about pain tolerance at all. It was about the courage to remain curious, the wisdom to question assumptions, and the strength to build something better from the pieces of what you thought you knew.